In the quiet grid of Chicago's South Side, on a street named for the vast prairies that once defined this land, stands a monument to a forgotten war. It is not a statue of bronze or a plaque of marble. It is a house. 7244 South Prairie Avenue. To the casual observer, it is just another derelict property, a two-story brick structure surrendering slowly to the forces of time and neglect, its face a mask of urban decay. The paint peels back like sunburnt skin, revealing the tired brick beneath. Windows, once portals to a private world, are now vacant eyes, some boarded shut, as if to keep ghosts in rather than people out. The yard, a small patch of city earth, is a tangle of defiant weeds, a wild garden thriving on abandonment. The silence that surrounds it is heavy, a different kind of quiet from the gentle hum of the neighborhood. It is the silence of a place that has exhausted its purpose. This structure was never a palace. It boasts no soaring columns, no sprawling wings, no grand portico to announce the wealth of its owner. Its architecture is humble, utilitarian, designed to blend into the working-class fabric of the Park Manor neighborhood. It was built to be overlooked, to be dismissed as just another family home on just another street. This modesty was its most profound and terrifying deception. For this was not a home, it was a throne room disguised as a parlor. It was a fortress, engineered to look like a residence. Behind its unassuming facade of brown brick, a different reality was constructed, one of steel-reinforced doors and shuttered windows hiding iron bars. It was a bunker built not to display power, but to insulate it, to protect it from the very world it sought to control. From this deceptively ordinary house, an empire of unprecedented scale was commanded. Orders were given that would echo in the rattle of machine guns across the city, decisions made that would corrupt the highest offices of law and government. Rivers of illegal alcohol, mountains of cash, and the destinies of countless lives were managed from within these walls, all while the scent of family dinners drifted from the kitchen. The house stands today as a physical scar on the city's memory, a point of contention and morbid fascination. For decades, its fate has been debated. Some argue for its preservation as a historical landmark, a tangible piece of a defining American era. Others demand its demolition, wishing to erase the stain of the man who made it infamous, to deny him any claim to permanence. It is more than a building. It is a silent accomplice. Its foundations absorbed the constant thrum of paranoia. Its walls bore witness to whispered conspiracies and strategic brutality. It was the stage for a great psychological drama, the duality of a man who craved legitimacy while perfecting the art of the outlaw, who played the part of a doting father in the same space where he plotted the systematic takedown of his rivals. The air around it still feels charged with the residue of that conflict. One can almost sense the ghosts of hulking bodyguards on the porch, see the flicker of shadows from behind drawn curtains, hear the echo of an armored Cadillac idling at the curb. The house holds its secrets tightly, its decay a form of stubborn loyalty to the man who gave it its dark soul. It is an architectural paradox, a symbol of immense power that chose not to shout but to whisper. Its very existence challenges our understanding of wealth and influence, suggesting that true control is not always found in the most opulent displays, but in the most carefully constructed deceptions. Its quiet presence on this residential street is a testament to an invisible authority that once held a metropolis in its grip. Today, its power is gone, replaced by the slow, inexorable power of entropy. The iron bars rust, the reinforced doors sag on their hinges, and the strategic silence has been replaced by the emptiness of abandonment. It is a hollowed-out shell, a relic whose significance is slowly being eroded by the wind and the rain, yet it refuses to completely disappear. What remains is the story of how this simple brick house on the south side of Chicago became the nerve center of Al Capone's criminal enterprise. It is a story of ambition, violence, and the profound illusion that any fortress, whether of brick or of ego, can ever be truly impenetrable. The house was the mask, the respectable face of an unspeakable operation. But what it concealed behind its common brick facade was the blueprint for conquering a city. To understand the man, one must first enter the fortress he built, not with grandeur, but with fear. If you wish to uncover the secrets sealed within these walls, subscribe and continue this journey into the heart of an empire. Before the house on Prairie Avenue had a name attached to its deed, there was the man who would give it its soul. He was not born of Chicago's wind and steel, but in the dense, teeming warrens of Brooklyn, New York, at the turn of a century that promised everything to men who were willing to take it. Born Alphonse Capone in 1899, he was a child of the immigrant dream, or perhaps its darker, more pragmatic shadow. His parents were honest Italian immigrants, part of a wave of humanity seeking purchase on the slippery rungs of American society. The world that shaped him was one of stark contrasts: the piety of the church on Sunday and the brutal codes of the street on Monday. It was a landscape of crowded tenements, the smell of coal smoke and cooking mingling in the air, a place where survival was a lesson learned early and often. For a bright, ambitious boy with a formidable physical presence, the paths to success were few, and the straightest one was rarely the most profitable. The formal education system offered little to a mind like his. It ended abruptly in the 6th grade after a violent confrontation with a teacher. A final, defiant act against a world of rules he already sensed were not written for him. His true apprenticeship began not in a classroom, but on the unforgiving cobblestones of New York. He fell under the tutelage of the 5 Points Gang, a school of hard knocks where the curriculum was extortion, violence, and the art of the hustle. It was here he learned the fundamental arithmetic of the underworld, that fear was a more reliable currency than respect, and that loyalty was a commodity to be bought and managed, never blindly trusted. He was a bouncer, a bartender, a guardian of illicit enterprises, learning the mechanics of a world that operated in the shadows of the legitimate one. It was in this crucible that he met Johnny Torrio, a different breed of criminal. Torrio was not merely a thug, he was a strategist, the diplomat of the underworld, who saw crime not as a series of chaotic skirmishes, but as a business to be organized, centralized, and scaled. He saw in the young Capone a raw combination of intelligence and ferocity, a potential that, if properly molded, could be immensely powerful. Torrio became his mentor, teaching him the value of patience, the importance of political connections, and the necessity of masking brutality with a veneer of civility. This period also left him with a physical mark that would define his public persona. A dispute in a saloon led to a knife slash across his left cheek, a permanent triptych of scars that he would carry for the rest of his life. The press would later dub him Scarface, a nickname he loathed, for it spoke of the very street-level violence he sought to transcend. He preferred to see himself as a businessman, a public figure, and the scar was a crude reminder of a past he was determined to orchestrate, not just endure. Amidst this education in violence, a parallel life was being constructed. He married May Coughlin, an Irish Catholic girl, and soon after, their son, Albert Francis Capone, known as Sonny, was born. This was not a mere convenience, but a deep-seated need. The family represented a world of order, love, and legitimacy that stood in stark opposition to his professional life. It was an anchor, a claim to the very normalcy his actions were systematically destroying for others. This duality would become the central conflict of his existence, a psychological fissure running through the heart of his ambition. The call to a grander stage came in 1919. Johnny Torrio, having moved to Chicago to manage the criminal interests of his uncle, Big Jim Colosimo, summoned his protégé. Capone left New York behind, arriving in a city that was a perfect storm of opportunity. Chicago was a brawling, dynamic metropolis, a hub of industry and transportation, its political and law enforcement systems already riddled with a deep-seated functional corruption. It was a city ready for the taking, a kingdom waiting for a king. Then, in 1920, the United States government handed men like Capone the key to that kingdom. The 18th Amendment and the Volstead Act became law, ushering in the era of prohibition. In a single legislative stroke, the nation's thirst for alcohol was not eliminated, but criminalized. An entire industry worth billions was gifted to the underworld. It was the single greatest business opportunity in the history of American organized crime. And Capone was in the right place at the right time with exactly the right set of skills. Suddenly, the business of vice was no longer a collection of neighborhood rackets. It was a matter of logistics, supply chains, and mass distribution. It required fleets of trucks, secret breweries, networks of speakeasies, and an army of enforcers. Under Torrio's guidance, Capone quickly proved he was more than a bouncer. He was an organizational genius, a master of logistics who could manage the flow of illegal liquor with the efficiency of a railroad tycoon. He understood that violence was not an end in itself, but a tool for market consolidation. Rivals were not just enemies, they were competitors to be eliminated through hostile takeovers, often conducted with machine guns. He also grasped the critical importance of infrastructure. Bribes were not just payoffs, they were investments in a system of impunity, ensuring that police, politicians, and judges were all stakeholders in the success of his enterprise. As his power and wealth grew in the shadow of Torrio's empire, the need for a physical anchor became paramount. He was no longer a transient enforcer living in rented rooms. He was a man of means, a husband, a father. He needed a home, but the concept of home for a man in his position was a complex equation of security, strategy, and symbolism. It could not simply be a place to live. It had to be a base of operations, a sanctuary, and a statement. In 1923, he found the answer. Not in the opulent Gold Coast mansions of the city's established elite, nor in a secluded country estate. He found it in a modest, two-story brick house at 7244 South Prairie Avenue in the working-class neighborhood of Park Manor. The purchase price was a mere $5,500, an insignificant sum for a man whose weekly income was beginning to dwarf the annual salaries of corporate presidents. The choice was entirely deliberate. The house was a piece of strategic camouflage. To the outside world, it broadcast a message of humility. It said he was still Al from the block, an Italian-American who had made good but had not forgotten his roots. It allowed him to cultivate the image of a family man, a pillar of the community, living amongst the very people he both served and terrorized. The neighbors saw a doting father playing with his son in the yard, a wealthy benefactor who handed out cash to those in need. This facade of normalcy was the house's primary function. It was his greatest alibi, a constant, silent testament to a respectability he craved as intensely as he craved power. He wanted to be seen as a modern-day Robin Hood, a public servant providing a desired commodity that a hypocritical government had banned. The unassuming brick exterior of the Prairie Avenue house was the uniform for this role. The costume for the part he was playing for the city of Chicago. But behind this carefully constructed stage set, a different reality was taking shape. The man who lived there was acutely aware that his ascent was built on a foundation of violence and betrayal. He was surrounded by enemies, from rival gangs to ambitious prosecutors to treacherous allies within his own organization. His world was one of constant threat, and this deep-seated paranoia began to seep into the very structure of his new home. The house had to be more than a symbol. It had to be a fortress. The renovations began almost immediately, transforming the ordinary residence into a hardened bunker. The changes were not visible from the street. They were internal, woven into the fabric of the building like a secret armor. Standard wooden doors were replaced with steel-reinforced ones. The windows, which looked out onto the quiet residential street, were fitted with heavy shutters that concealed iron bars on the inside. The house was being hardened, its domestic shell filled with the cold logic of a military installation. This was not the architecture of ostentation, but the architecture of fear. Every modification was a response to a potential threat, every reinforced beam a testament to his understanding that the empire he was building was inherently unstable. The house was becoming a physical manifestation of his fractured psyche, a warm, inviting home for his beloved family on one level, and a cold, impenetrable fortress for his criminal enterprise on another. It was designed to absorb the psychological tension of a man living two lives under one roof. The basement in particular was repurposed. It ceased to be a space for storage and became the nascent nerve center of the Chicago outfit. Here, away from the domestic scenes unfolding on the floors above, strategies were debated. Plans were laid for the expansion of bootlegging operations, the takeover of gambling rackets, and the systematic elimination of rivals. The very foundations of the house began to absorb the vibrations of a burgeoning criminal empire. The home became a paradox. It was a place designed to project an image of harmlessness while functioning as the command post for one of the most violent organizations in American history. It was a sanctuary intended to shield his wife and son from the brutal realities of his profession, yet it was also the epicenter from which that brutality was directed. The scent of May Capone's cooking in the kitchen could mingle with the cigar smoke of lieutenants in the back room discussing the logistics of an assassination. This structure on Prairie Avenue was the perfect solution to Capone's central dilemma. It allowed him to maintain the illusion of a separation between his two worlds, even as they bled into one another within its walls. The house was his accomplice, a silent partner in the grand deception. It held his secrets, protected his family, and served as the unassuming throne from which he would soon rule an invisible empire. The modest brick building was no longer just a house. It was the physical embodiment of a dream of power, a dream built on the conviction that with enough steel, enough cash, and enough fear, any man could build a fortress impenetrable to the outside world. The year 1925 marked a seismic shift in the tectonic plates of Chicago's underworld. Following an assassination attempt that nearly claimed his life, Johnny Torrio, the thoughtful architect of the city's criminal syndicate, abdicated his throne. He handed the keys to his sprawling, violent kingdom to his most promising and ferocious protégé. At 26 years old, Al Capone became the undisputed commander of the Chicago outfit, and his ascent to power would be measured not just in dollars and bodies, but in brick and mortar. The house on Prairie Avenue ceased to be merely a residence. It transformed into the capital of an invisible empire. As Capone's influence radiated outwards, corrupting the city block by block, the house began to turn inwards, hardening its shell. It was no longer just a home he had purchased, but an extension of his own will, a physical manifestation of his strategy, his paranoia, and his profound, gnawing desire for a legitimacy he could never truly possess. Its function became threefold, a trinity of purpose that defined its existence. It was a mask, presenting a face of benign domesticity to the world. It was a weapon, the command center from which a war for the soul of a city was directed. And it was a refuge, a psychological bunker designed to insulate its master from the chaos he himself unleashed. A fortress that would eventually become his prison. The mask was its most subtle and effective function. To the residents of Park Manor, 7244 South Prairie was the home of a wealthy and generous businessman. They saw Mr. Capone as a neighborhood figure, a man who had made his fortune in the second-hand furniture business, a plausible if vague explanation for his obvious wealth. They saw his wife, May, a quiet and respectable woman, and his son, Sonny, for whom lavish birthday parties were thrown in the yard, creating a tableau of perfect American domesticity. This performance was meticulously curated. Capone understood the power of appearances. The modest brick facade was his greatest architectural alibi. It deflected suspicion and humanized him in the press and in the public imagination. While the Northside Gangsters operated from flashy headquarters, Capone's base was a symbol of working-class success, a deliberate choice that allowed him to cultivate an image as a man of the people, an Italian-American success story who had not abandoned his roots. The constant traffic of expensive, armor-plated Cadillacs and the quiet presence of hulking men in tailored suits were explained away as the comings and goings of business associates. The house absorbed these anomalies into its narrative of normalcy. It was a stage where the mundane rituals of family life were played out in the foreground, deliberately obscuring the strategic conferences and brutal calculations happening just feet away, behind a closed door. But behind the mask, the house was being forged into a weapon. The quiet residential street was the perfect cover for the central nervous system of a massive criminal enterprise. The basement, cool and removed from the life of the floors above, was the true seat of power. It was here, amidst the foundations of the home, that the strategies for the outfit's expansion were debated and finalized. From this subterranean command center, Capone and his lieutenants managed a logistical operation of staggering complexity. Maps of the city were not just geographical records, they were battle plans, marked with the locations of rival speakeasies to be seized, breweries to be protected, and precincts with friendly police captains. Phone calls made from this house dispatched fleets of trucks carrying illegal liquor, their routes as carefully planned as a military convoys. The house became the central bank for an economy built on cash. Suitcases filled with the day's earnings from thousands of speakeasies, gambling dens, and brothels would arrive under the cover of darkness. Here the money was counted, sorted and bundled by trusted accountants like Jake Guzik. Bribes were allocated, payrolls for an army of enforcers were prepared, and the vast profits were funneled into laundering operations, all under the roof that sheltered a sleeping child. Every major decision that shaped Chicago's bloody landscape in the late 1920s emanated from this building. The systematic consolidation of the bootlegging industry, the infiltration of labor unions, the placement of corrupt officials in key city hall positions, all were conceived within these walls. The violence was outsourced, but its intellectual origin was here. The house did not have blood on its floors, but it was the brain that commanded the hand that pulled the trigger. The cold, calculated logic of the St. Valentine's Day massacre, an act of corporate terrorism designed to annihilate the rival North Side gang, found its incubator in the strategic sessions held in this house. The planning, the acquisition of police uniforms, the selection of the executioners, these were business decisions. And 7244 South Prairie was the corporate headquarters where they were made. The house was an accessory before the fact to the most infamous gangland slaying in American history. Simultaneously, as the house's function as a weapon grew, so too did its role as a refuge. Capone's power made him a target. He was a king who lived under the constant threat of assassination from rivals, betrayal from within his own ranks, and prosecution from the law. This creeping paranoia seeped into the very structure of his home, transforming it from a simple residence into a hardened military outpost. The renovations were extensive but discreet. The front door, which appeared to be a standard heavy oak, was backed with a thick plate of steel. The windows on the ground floor, which looked out onto the tranquil street, were fitted with interior iron bars, hidden from view by heavy drapes and shutters. The house was being armored, its domestic skin concealing a skeleton of impenetrable security. A network of bodyguards operated in shifts, their presence a constant, low-frequency hum of vigilance. They occupied rooms within the house and positions in adjacent buildings, their eyes perpetually scanning the street for any sign of threat. No one approached the house without being identified and vetted. The property was an island of absolute control in a sea of urban chaos. This obsession with security turned the home into a psychological bunker. It was a place where Capone could lower his guard, but only within a perimeter he had fortified against the world. The walls were designed not just to keep assassins out, but to contain his own anxieties. The house became the only place on earth where he could feel a semblance of safety. Yet that safety was an artificial construct, a constant reminder of the mortal danger that defined his life. The duality of the house's existence created a schizophrenic atmosphere. Upstairs, May Capone attempted to maintain a sanctuary of domestic peace. The scent of her cooking would drift through the halls, a fragile symbol of a normal life. Downstairs, or in the back rooms, Capone and his men would be discussing matters of life and death, their cigar smoke a thick conspiratorial haze. These two worlds of family and violence were separated only by a floorboard, a closed door. The structure itself seemed to absorb this tension. The floors must have creaked under the weight of men carrying weapons and secrets. The walls, silent witnesses to countless conspiracies, held the echoes of whispered threats and strategic bargains. The very air within the house was charged with the electric current of a man living two irreconcilable lives simultaneously. As the empire reached its zenith, the house became its ultimate physical expression. Every new territory conquered, every rival eliminated, every official bribed, seemed to add another layer of invisible armor to its brick facade. It was no longer just a building. It was a living organism, its heartbeat the steady rhythmic flow of illicit cash, its thoughts the dark ambitions of the man who ruled from within. The luxuries it contained were not those of a sprawling palace, but of a king in his command tent. The cellar was stocked not with fine wines for leisurely consumption, but with the best imported whiskies and champagnes, the very contraband that fueled the empire, a private reserve of the spoils of war. The closets upstairs held rows of custom-made silk suits and diamond-studded jewelry, the uniform and insignia of a monarch whose kingdom was the streets. It was a fortress built not of stone and turrets, but of urban brick, steel reinforcements, and a carefully constructed lie. It stood as a monument to a new kind of power, one that did not need to announce itself with grand architecture. Its power was in its deception, in its ability to project authority from a place no one would ever suspect of being a throne room. The house was complicit in every crime, a silent partner in the vast criminal conspiracy. It provided the secure location for plans to be made, and the respectable alibi for the man who made them. It shielded his family from the violence of his profession while serving as the very epicenter from which that violence was directed. It was a masterpiece of strategic architecture, a home built to wage a war. The concrete in its foundation seemed to draw strength from the corruption that held the city in its grip. The steel in its doors was a physical manifestation of the iron will of its owner. The entire structure was a testament to Capone's core belief that he could build a world of his own, governed by his own rules and seal it off from the consequences. This was the house at the height of its power, a perfect synthesis of mask, weapon, and refuge. It was the face of legitimacy and the heart of a criminal enterprise. It offered sanctuary while enabling warfare. It was the most potent symbol of Al Capone's reign, an unassuming brick building that held an entire metropolis hostage. The confidence it projected was immense, a physical echo of Capone's own burgeoning narcissism. He had built an empire and a fortress to protect it, and from within its walls he must have felt truly untouchable, a modern emperor ruling from a deceptively modest palace. His vanity, fed by immense wealth and unchecked power, was reflected in every aspect of his life, from his flamboyant attire to his public pronouncements. The house itself, in its calculated humility, was perhaps the greatest expression of this ego, a demonstration that he was so powerful he did not need to show it. But what, in this theater of ambition, was the truest testament to his vanity? Was it the reinforced steel of his private fortress, a declaration that he was a man important enough to require such defenses? Was it the diamond stickpin that glittered in the dim light of the basement, a small, perfect symbol of the immense wealth he commanded? Or was it the simple, audacious belief that this ordinary brick house could make him forever untouchable? Feel free to share your thoughts in the comments below. By the late 1920s, the house on Prairie Avenue had reached its final, most potent form. It was no longer a structure in transformation, but a perfected instrument of power, a quiet monolith at the center of a sprawling, invisible web. From the outside, its placid brick facade offered the same unassuming greeting to the neighborhood. The rhythms of the street continued unabated. Children played, delivery trucks rumbled past, neighbors exchanged pleasantries. Yet within its walls, the house operated with the relentless, silent efficiency of a sovereign nation's treasury, processing the immense revenues of a kingdom built on vice. The lifeblood of this kingdom was cash. It arrived not in armored trucks, but in the mundane containers of a world trying to look normal. Leather briefcases, cloth sacks, sometimes even cardboard boxes carried by men who looked like salesmen or laborers. They would arrive at night, entering through a back door, their movements swift and economical. Inside, the currency was stripped of its humble packaging, revealing stacks of worn bills that smelled of the thousands of hands they had passed through, hands in speakeasies, gambling dens, and brothels across the metropolis. The basement had become a dedicated counting house, a subterranean vault where the raw, chaotic earnings of the street were tamed and organized. Under the stark glare of a few bare light bulbs, trusted financial lieutenants like Jake Guzik oversaw a meticulous operation. Men with deft fingers, their faces impassive, sat at long tables, their movements practiced and swift. They sorted, stacked, and bundled the cash, their quiet concentration transforming the proceeds of violence and desperation into the orderly columns of a corporate ledger. The sheer volume was staggering, a torrent of paper money that defied conventional comprehension. On a good week, the income could exceed $100,000, a figure equivalent to millions today. This was not the profit of a single enterprise, but the combined tribute from 1,000 different streams, each a testament to a city's insatiable thirsts and the organization's absolute control over them. The house was the reservoir into which all these streams flowed, the central point of collection for a liquid empire. But this mountain of cash presented a fundamental paradox. It was the ultimate proof of success, yet in its raw form, it was a dangerous liability. It was heavy, difficult to store, and every single bill was a piece of physical evidence, a direct link to a criminal conspiracy. The greatest challenge for the outfit was not earning the money, but cleansing it, transforming it from dirty evidence into usable, legitimate capital. The house on Prairie Avenue was the administrative center for this grand alchemy. The primary instrument of this transformation was a sprawling network of legitimate-seeming businesses. Capone's organization owned or controlled dozens of them: laundries, cleaning and dyeing services, second-hand furniture stores, nightclubs, and various small-scale retail operations. These were not just investments. They were industrial-grade washing machines for money, their public-facing operations a thin cover for their true clandestine purpose. The irony was palpable. Cash earned in the dark was laundered in businesses that specialized in making things clean. The process was a masterpiece of financial deception. A laundry that might have a legitimate daily income of a few $100s would declare earnings of several thousand. The illicit cash from the bootlegging operations would be mixed in with the real receipts and deposited into the business's bank account. The deposits were carefully managed, broken into smaller, less conspicuous amounts, and spread across numerous accounts in various banks, creating a confusing, tangled web designed to frustrate any potential audit. This intricate system depended on a silent army of complicit individuals. It required bookkeepers willing to falsify ledgers, business managers who asked no questions, and most critically, bank employees who were either intimidated or bribed into ignoring the constant, suspicious flow of cash. The corruption was not just at the top. It was a cancer that had metastasized throughout the city's commercial and financial infrastructure, making honest men and women into unwitting cogs in a criminal machine. Beyond the world of commerce, the money flowed upwards, buying the most valuable commodity of all: impunity. A significant portion of the cash counted in the basement was earmarked for bribes, an operational expense as vital as paying for whiskey or bullets. This river of money irrigated the arid fields of political power, ensuring a harvest of protection. At the apex of this system stood figures like Chicago Mayor William Hale, Big Bill Thompson, whose political machine ran on the fuel provided by Capone's enterprise. The system of bribery was organized with bureaucratic precision. Regular cash payments were delivered to a vast list of recipients. Police captains in key districts received weekly envelopes to ensure their officers would be conveniently absent during liquor shipments. Prosecutors were paid to lose evidence or bungle cases. Judges were on retainer to guarantee favorable rulings or dismiss charges altogether. From the house on Prairie Avenue, Capone managed a shadow government, its authority far more absolute than the one operating out of City Hall. The result was a state of functional immunity. The Chicago outfit operated with a freedom that was breathtaking in its audacity. When raids did occur, they were often theatrical performances, tipped off in advance to ensure that nothing of value would be found. When Capone's men were arrested, they were rarely held for long. The system was designed to catch them and then let them go, a revolving door of justice greased with cash. The fortress on Prairie Avenue was not just a physical structure. It was the center of a legal and political shield that made its master untouchable. Inside the house, the atmosphere hummed with this absolute control. The physical security was a given, a constant low-level thrum of vigilance. Hulking bodyguards were a permanent fixture, their presence so integrated into the domestic landscape that they seemed like part of the furniture. They were silent, watchful, their eyes missing nothing, their loyalty absolute. They were the Praetorian Guard for a suburban emperor, ensuring the perimeter of the fortress was never breached. Life within this perimeter was a study in controlled schizophrenia. On the upper floor, May Capone tried to carve out a space of domestic tranquility for her and their son, Sonny. The routines of family life persisted. Meals were cooked, homework was done. A semblance of normalcy was fiercely maintained. This fragile peace existed in stark juxtaposition to the reality unfolding just one floor below, where decisions that would result in death and ruin were being made with cold, businesslike detachment. Capone moved between these two worlds with unnerving ease. In one moment, he was the doting father, patient and gentle with his hearing-impaired son. In the next, he was the absolute ruler of his organization, his voice low and steady as he issued commands that would echo in the back alleys of the city. He was not a frenzied mob boss, but a chairman of the board, presiding over his violent corporation from the comfort of his fortified home. The house also served as a venue for displays of this power. Lavish parties were a regular occurrence, but the guest list was carefully curated. These were not gatherings for Chicago's high society, who viewed Capone with a mixture of fear and contempt. Instead, the guests were the key figures of his own world, his most trusted lieutenants, allied mobsters, high-ranking police officials, and corrupt politicians who came to pay their respects and reaffirm their allegiance. These events were a theater of largesse and intimidation. The finest illegal champagne and whiskey flowed freely. Mountains of food were served. Capone, dressed in his immaculate silk suits, would move through the rooms like a benevolent monarch, dispensing cash, expensive gifts, and quiet promises. It was a performance designed to reinforce loyalty, to display the immense rewards of his favor, and implicitly the terrible cost of his displeasure. Everything about this life was a projection, an attempt to build a reality that mirrored his monumental ego. The house, in its feigned modesty, was central to this projection. It allowed him to maintain the fiction that he was merely a successful businessman, a family man who happened to be wealthy. It was the anchor for the public persona he cultivated so carefully, that of a modern Robin Hood, a necessary evil in a hypocritical society. Yet the very fortifications that guaranteed his safety also ensured his isolation. The house became a gilded cage. He could not walk the streets of his own neighborhood without a phalanx of bodyguards. Every visitor, every delivery, every unfamiliar face was a potential threat to be assessed and neutralized. The world he controlled was a world he could no longer freely inhabit. The fortress built to keep his enemies out had effectively locked him in. This bunker mentality pervaded the entire structure. The heavy drapes were kept drawn not just for privacy, but to obscure the view from a potential sniper. The silence within the reinforced walls was different from the quiet of a normal home. It was a manufactured silence, a controlled environment heavy with the weight of secrets and the constant unspoken possibility of violence. The house was a sanctuary that felt like a prison. At the zenith of his reign, the system he had built from within this house seemed flawless, a self-perpetuating machine of profit and power. The money flowed in, the protection was absolute, the city was his. From his command post on Prairie Avenue, Al Capone could look out from behind his shuttered windows and see a kingdom that bent to his will. He was more than a gangster. He was an institution, and his home was his monument to that fact. He had built an empire and a fortress to house its heart, and in his magnificent arrogance, he believed both were impregnable. The structure was a testament to his control over the material world of guns, steel, and brick. But the true vulnerability of his empire lay not in its physical defenses, but in an element he dismissed as trivial: the quiet, meticulous work of accountants. The fortress was designed to stop bullets, not ledgers. The architecture of power, like that of any building, is subject to stress. For years, the empire constructed from 7244 South Prairie Avenue seemed to possess an impossible tensile strength, its foundations rooted in a perfect equilibrium of fear, corruption, and public apathy. But in the winter of 1929, that equilibrium was shattered by an act of supreme self-destructive arrogance. The St. Valentine's Day massacre was not merely a mass murder, it was a strategic miscalculation of seismic proportions. It was too loud, too brutal, too public. It was the sound of a structure cracking under the weight of its own hubris. The slaughter of 7 men from the rival North Side gang, lined up against a garage wall and executed by men in police uniforms, was a message of absolute dominance intended for the Chicago underworld. But the message that was received echoed far beyond the city limits. It reached the White House, where a newly inaugurated President Herbert Hoover, appalled by the brazen lawlessness, saw Capone not as a local problem, but as a national disgrace. The order was given, simple and direct: get Capone. The war was no longer a street-level turf dispute. It had become a federal crusade. Suddenly, the house on Prairie Avenue found itself at the center of a new and unfamiliar map. It was no longer just the capital of a criminal fiefdom, but a primary target for the full, dispassionate weight of the United States government. The fortress, designed to repel the chaotic violence of rival gangsters, was now facing a siege from an enemy that operated not with Thompson's submachine guns, but with subpoenas, audits, and the relentless patience of bureaucracy. This was a war of attrition, and the house was the primary asset to be neutralized. The first wave of the federal assault was loud and visible. A special unit from the Treasury Department, led by a young, determined agent named Elliot Ness, began a systematic campaign against the empire's most visible asset, its breweries and distilleries. Ness and his team, later mythologized as the Untouchables, conducted a series of high-profile raids, smashing barrels, seizing trucks, and disrupting the vast logistical network that supplied the city with illegal alcohol. Each raid was a hammer blow against the infrastructure of the outfit. These actions were more than just a financial inconvenience. They were a direct assault on Capone's aura of invincibility. For the first time, the public saw his operations being successfully attacked, his control challenged. Newspapers that had once treated him with a kind of grudging admiration now ran front-page photos of his breweries being dismantled by federal agents. The myth of the untouchable crime lord, so carefully cultivated from within the brick house, was beginning to show visible fissures. From his command post, Capone watched these developments with a mixture of irritation and contempt. He saw Ness as a publicity-seeking upstart, a minor player in a game he had mastered. His monumental ego, the very engine of his success, now became his greatest vulnerability. He could not comprehend that this was more than a public relations battle. He failed to see that the noisy raids were merely a diversion, a public spectacle designed to mask a far more dangerous, silent attack. This second front was being waged not in the streets, but in the quiet, dusty offices of the Internal Revenue Service. It was led by a man who was the antithesis of Al Capone in every conceivable way. Frank J. Wilson, a quiet, methodical forensic accountant. Wilson was not interested in kicking down doors or making headlines. He was interested in numbers. He operated on a simple, profound principle. No matter how complex the criminal enterprise, its ultimate purpose was profit, and profit leaves a trace. Wilson's strategy was to ignore the crimes of violence and focus on the crime of wealth. Capone's empire generated an income of millions, yet the man himself had never filed a federal income tax return. His defense was simple. He had no legitimate income to declare. He conducted all his business in cash, owned no assets in his own name, and signed nothing. He believed he had constructed a perfect financial fortress, a ghost in the economic system. His greatest mistake was his vanity. The lifestyle he so publicly embraced was a walking, talking ledger of his undeclared income. The $1,000 suits, the diamond jewelry, the armored limousines, the sprawling Florida estate, all were tangible proof of a fortune that officially did not exist. He was undone not by what he hid, but by what he flaunted. His own arrogance became the star witness for the prosecution. The house on Prairie Avenue, once a symbol of his discreet power, now became the focal point of a new kind of siege. The fortress was under constant surveillance. Unremarkable men in dark sedans would park for hours down the street, their eyes chronicling every arrival and departure. They were not looking for guns or contraband. They were mapping the human architecture of the organization, identifying the bagmen, the accountants, and the lieutenants who formed the links in the financial chain. The paranoia that had been engineered into the house's very structure began to curdle. The fear of a sniper's bullet or a rival's bomb was a familiar, manageable threat. This new fear was insidious and formless. It was the fear of being watched by an invisible enemy, the anxiety that every conversation might be overheard, that every associate could become a government witness. The fortress, once a sanctuary, was beginning to feel like a cage under a microscope. For 2 years, Wilson's team painstakingly assembled their case. They followed the money backward from its destination, interviewing terrified business owners, disgruntled former employees, and anyone who had ever been on the receiving end of the outfit's cash flow. They sifted through bank records, property deeds, and corporate filings, searching for any crack in the wall of cash that protected Capone. The work was frustrating and often fruitless. The outfit's code of silence, a brutal mixture of loyalty and terror, held firm. Key witnesses disappeared or developed sudden amnesia. The paper trail was a deliberately tangled maze, designed to lead nowhere. It seemed Capone's system was as impenetrable as he believed. The fortress of silence was holding. Then came the breakthrough. It arrived not with a dramatic confession, but from a mundane source, a raid on one of Capone's smaller gambling operations. Buried in a back room, investigators found a set of ledgers. These were not the master books of the empire, but they were a start. Under the immense pressure of a long federal sentence, a bookkeeper who had managed the books for a Cicero brothel agreed to cooperate. The first crack appeared in the wall of Omerta. These ledgers were the key, the Rosetta Stone that allowed Wilson's team to decipher the financial language of the outfit. They detailed daily receipts, expenses, and, most critically, profit distributions. For the first time, the investigators had hard physical evidence of the vast sums of money the organization was generating, a detailed accounting of the criminal enterprise in the bookkeeper's own hand. Within these columns of numbers, Wilson found the final, fatal piece of evidence he needed. It was a simple, careless annotation in a cash payout ledger. A note indicating a specific share of the profits was to be set aside for a man referred to only as Al. It was a tiny slip, a moment of administrative sloppiness in an otherwise disciplined operation, but it was enough. The ghost in the machine now had a name. The steel-reinforced doors and shuttered windows of 7244 South Prairie Avenue were useless against this kind of weapon. The army of bodyguards, trained to stop bullets, could not stop a court order. The fortress had been built to withstand a physical assault, but its defenses were being rendered irrelevant by the quiet, methodical work of an accountant. The empire was not being taken by force, it was being foreclosed on. From the street, nothing appeared to have changed. The house stood as it always had, a solid, unassuming monument to its owner's power. The expensive cars continued their silent processions to and from the curb, but inside, the atmosphere had irrevocably shifted. The confidence had evaporated, replaced by the cold dread of an inevitable reckoning. The reign was over. The emperor was just the last to know. The final assault on the fortress was not a storm of bullets and splintering wood, but the quiet, inexorable arrival of a legal document. On June 5, 1931, a federal grand jury handed down an indictment against Al Capone, not for murder or bootlegging, but for 22 counts of income tax evasion. The weapon that finally breached the walls of 7244 South Prairie Avenue was not a bomb but a piece of paper. Its language the cold, precise prose of the law. It was an enemy the house had never been designed to repel. From within his bunker, Capone greeted the news with a characteristic display of public contempt and private disbelief. He was a general who had spent his life fighting a certain kind of war, a war of territory and force, and he could not comprehend this new abstract battlefield. He still believed in the old currency of power, that a sufficient application of cash and intimidation could bend any system to his will. The house for a time reflected this delusion, its daily rhythms of command and domesticity continuing as if nothing had changed. The trial began on a crisp October morning. The spectacle was immediate. Capone, clad in a mustard yellow suit, arrived at the federal courthouse not as a visiting monarch, but as a defendant. The phalanx of bodyguards that surrounded him now seemed less a Praetorian guard and more a somber procession. He was forced to walk through a gauntlet of reporters and photographers, their flashbulbs like 1,000 tiny, merciless interrogations, stripping away the layers of his carefully constructed myth. Inside the courtroom, the architecture of justice superseded the architecture of crime. Here the rules were not his own. The high ceilings, the polished wood of the judge's bench, the rigid geometry of the jury box, all conspired to create an atmosphere of impersonal, unassailable authority. His personal magnetism, so effective in backrooms and speakeasies, was neutralized in this sterile environment. He was no longer the center of his own universe, but a single isolated figure, subject to a power greater than his own. The government's case, meticulously assembled by George E.Q. Johnson's team, was a masterpiece of anticlimax. There were no tales of bloody massacres or daring liquor runs. Instead, the prosecution unspooled a dry, methodical narrative of numbers, of income and expenditure, of a vast fortune that had simply failed to appear on any tax return. The primary weapon was not a witness to murder, but the quiet, damning testimony of a ledger book. Frank Wilson's years of painstaking work were presented to the jury with a calm, surgical precision. Charts and documents illustrated the flow of money, transforming the chaotic, cash-based empire into a clear and simple diagram of criminal enterprise. When the prosecution produced a ledger detailing the profits from a Cicero gambling den, with its handwritten annotation earmarking a share for Al, the effect in the courtroom was not of a bombshell, but of a quiet final click of a lock. Then came the witnesses, bookkeepers and former employees, men who had once lived under the shadow of the outfit's brutal code of silence, took the stand. Their voices were often low, their fear still palpable, but they spoke. They testified to the mountains of cash, to the system of payouts, to the man who sat just feet away as the ultimate beneficiary of it all. Each word was a small, sharp tool, chipping away at the foundations of the fortress on Prairie Avenue. Capone watched the proceedings with a growing sense of detachment, as if observing the dissection of a stranger's life. This world of debits and credits was alien to him. He was a master of the tangible, of fear, loyalty, and violence, but the abstract logic of the law was a language he could not speak. The confident mask he wore in public began to show cracks, revealing the confusion of a king who had been drawn into a game whose rules he did not understand. His defense attorneys fought valiantly, attempting to discredit the witnesses and dismiss the ledgers as unreliable. They argued that there was no direct proof, no document bearing Capone's signature, that linked him to the income. But they were fighting a ghost. They could not argue away the simple, undeniable reality of his lifestyle, the mansions, the cars, the clothes, which stood as a silent, screaming testament to an immense, undeclared fortune. The jury, a panel of men selected from outside the corrupt ecosystem of Chicago, listened impassively. They were farmers, clerks, and small businessmen, representatives of the very world Capone had sought to both dominate and defy. They were the one element in the equation he could not control. They could not be bought, they could not be intimidated, and they held his fate in their hands. The closing arguments framed the two opposing realities. The prosecution described a man who had built a shadow government, a parasite on the American system, who believed himself to be above its most fundamental laws. The defense painted a portrait of a misunderstood public benefactor, a victim of a government vendetta. But the evidence had already told its own, more compelling story. Then came the moment of reckoning. The jury filed back into the courtroom, their faces unreadable. The silence was heavy and absolute, say a vacuum into which the power and noise of an entire era seemed to be drawn. Miles away, the brick house on Prairie Avenue stood under the autumn sky, a silent, unknowing accomplice awaiting the verdict that would determine its future. Guilty. The word, when it came, was not a shout, but a simple declarative statement. It was a formal, legalistic word, yet it landed with the force of a physical blow. It was the sound of an illusion shattering, the myth of the untouchable crime lord dissolving into the mundane reality of a convicted felon. The sharp, decisive rap of Judge Wilkerson's gavel was the sound of the fortress walls finally, irrevocably collapsing. The sentence was a final, crushing confirmation of his fall. 11 years in federal prison, a $50,000 fine, and liability for back taxes that would financially cripple him. Al Capone, the Emperor of Chicago, was led from the courtroom not to his armored Cadillac, but to a cell. His public life was over. The journey from the courthouse to the Cook County Jail was a final, humiliating parade, a public ritual of dethronement. The news ripped through the city and then the nation. The empire, which had seemed so monolithic, so indestructible, began to instantly destabilize. Without the singular unifying force of Capone's will and the fear he inspired, his lieutenants began to turn on one another. The invisible kingdom descended into a chaotic, bloody war of succession, and at 17244 South Prairie Avenue, the heart of that kingdom stopped beating. The steady flow of couriers with their bags of cash ceased. The quiet, watchful men who stood guard on the porch melted back into the city's shadows. The phone lines, which had once carried the orders that shaped the destiny of a metropolis, fell silent. The fortress was no longer a fortress. It was just a house on a quiet street, suddenly and unnervingly still. The arrival of the federal agents was devoid of drama. They did not storm the building. They knocked. The steel-reinforced front door, which had been installed to repel assassins and rival gangsters, was opened to them by a member of Capone's legal team. They entered not as an invading army, but as auditors, receivers for a bankrupt kingdom, their authority absolute and backed by the full weight of the state. Inside, the house presented itself as a physical autopsy of Capone's fractured life. On the main floors, the agents found the carefully maintained artifacts of a prosperous family. Plush furniture, family photographs, a child's toys. But in the basement and back rooms they found the cold, functional remnants of a corporate headquarters for crime. Empty safes, abandoned ledgers, the faint, lingering scent of cigar smoke and conspiracy. The house had become a crime scene, but the crime was not murder. It was wealth itself. Every object was now evidence, a piece of a puzzle that had already been solved. The opulence that had once been a symbol of untouchable power was now just a collection of assets to be seized and liquidated. The agents moved with a dispassionate efficiency, their task to dismantle the material symbols of a defeated monarch. They did not seek to understand the power that was built with concrete and steel, but to catalogue its remains. One is left to wonder if true power is what can be built, or what is left when the walls come down. If this question resonates with you, subscribe to explore more stories of empires that turned to dust. The agents' work was methodical. They tagged the custom-made suits hanging in the closets, inventoried the contents of the liquor cabinet filled with the very contraband that had built the empire, and made notes on the expensive jewelry left behind. Each item, once a testament to a life lived beyond the reach of the law, was now reduced to a line on an inventory sheet, its value assessed for auction. The soul of the house was being systematically removed. The objects that held the memory of power, of secret meetings and lavish parties, were stripped of their context. They were no longer symbols of a reign, but mere things, commodities to be sold off to satisfy a debt to the government. The house was being hollowed out, its authority and its history packed into boxes. The final, definitive act was the placement of a federal seal on the front door. This small official sticker was the fortress's epitaph. It declared, in the dispassionate language of the state, that the building and all its contents were now the property of the United States. The sovereignty of the Chicago outfit, which had once been absolute within these walls, was formally and completely extinguished. A new kind of silence settled over 7244 South Prairie Avenue. It was no longer the charged, watchful silence of a command post, humming with latent power. It was the deep, empty silence of a ruin, the sound of a place whose purpose has been exhausted. The house stood, but the empire it had sheltered was gone. The reign was over. The long, slow decay had begun. The fall of the emperor left a vacuum, not just in the city's underworld, but within the walls of his fortress. 7244 South Prairie Avenue, once the thrumming heart of a vast criminal circulatory system, was now a place of profound and unnatural stillness. The couriers no longer came, the bodyguards vanished, and the conspiracies that had soaked into the plasterboard evaporated into memory. The house, stripped of its purpose, began its slow, quiet return to being just a building, its dark energy dissipating like heat from a dying fire. Its life as a command center was over. Its long afterlife as a relic had begun. Far from Chicago, the man who gave the house its soul was being systematically unmade. In the federal penitentiary at Alcatraz, Al Capone ceased to be a name synonymous with power. He became prisoner AZ-85, a number in a system designed for absolute negation. The island fortress, a true prison of stone and sea, was a brutal parody of the one he had built for himself on Prairie Avenue. Here the steel bars were not a choice, but a certainty, the isolation not a strategy, but a punishment. The man who had commanded an army was now a captive, stripped of his silk suits, his diamond rings, and the fear that was his true currency. The most insidious decay, however, was not external, but internal. The neurosyphilis he had contracted in his youth, long dormant, began its final merciless assault on his mind. The strategic genius, the master of logistics and psychological warfare, began to unravel. His thoughts grew tangled, his memory frayed. The man who had held the secrets of a city in his head was reduced to a state of childlike confusion, his formidable intellect dissolving into the fog of a disease that no fortress could keep out. The ruin of his empire was followed by the ruin of his mind. Released from prison in 1939, he was a ghost of his former self, a hollowed-out effigy of the king he once was. He retreated to his opulent Florida mansion on Palm Island, another fortress, but one that now served only to contain his own mental collapse. He spent his final years lost in a world of delusions, a broken monarch, presiding over a kingdom of phantoms. In 1947, at the age of 48, his heart finally gave out. The death of Al Capone was not a dramatic, violent finale, but a quiet, pathetic fizzle, a footnote to a life that had once been front-page news. Back in Chicago, the house on Prairie Avenue lingered, a stubborn, physical reminder of a vanquished reign. It remained in the Capone family's name, a burdensome inheritance of brick and infamy. His wife May lived under the shadow of its reputation until 1952, when she finally sold the property, severing the last official link between the Capone name and the neighborhood it had once quietly terrorized. The deed was signed, the key turned over, and the house was cast adrift into the currents of time. For decades, the building passed from one owner to another, a piece of real estate forever haunted by its first and most notorious master. It could never be just a house. It was a destination for morbid tourists, a subject of whispered neighborhood lore, a dark star drawing the curious and the scholarly. It was a landmark of crime, a physical scar on the city's memory that refused to fully heal or disappear, its ordinary brick facade a permanent mask for an extraordinary and violent past. This notoriety made its existence a constant debate. In the late 20th century, proposals to designate it a historic landmark were met with fierce resistance. Residents of Park Manor argued against the glorification of a violent criminal, unwilling to have their community's identity defined by its most infamous inhabitant. The house became a battleground for memory itself, posing a difficult question. Should the architecture of crime be preserved as a historical lesson, or should it be erased to deny a killer any claim to permanence? While the debate raged, the house itself surrendered to a more elemental force: neglect. The paint began to peel, the porch sagged, and the windows were boarded up, giving the structure the vacant, blinded look of a skull. Weeds reclaimed the yard where a child once played, a wild, untamed garden thriving on abandonment. The physical decay of the building became a slow-motion echo of Capone's own decline, a testament to the universal law that all structures, whether of brick or of ego, are subject to entropy. Today it stands as an architectural ghost, its future uncertain, perpetually threatened by the wrecking ball. It is a cursed property, a place whose history is too heavy for its modest frame. It is less a monument and more a piece of evidence, a silent witness whose testimony is slowly being eroded by the wind and the rain. Its quiet, derelict presence is a constant, unsettling whisper from a past the city has tried to both mythologize and forget. In this, there is a final, circular irony. The house was first chosen for its ability to be overlooked, a strategic camouflage that allowed a criminal empire to flourish in plain sight. Now, in its state of advanced decay, it is once again in danger of being overlooked, of disappearing not as a strategic choice but as the final, inevitable outcome of abandonment. It has returned to the anonymity from which it came. But this time, the anonymity is one of obsolescence. The fortress of Prairie Avenue is the ultimate metaphor for the man who built it. Both were masters of the double life, presenting a facade of mundane respectability that concealed a core of calculated brutality. The house was designed to repel a violent external assault, only to be brought down by the silent internal workings of the law. The man built an empire to command the world, only to be imprisoned by the decay within his own mind. Both man and mansion now exist only as a story, a cautionary tale about the nature of power. The steel reinforcements could not stop a subpoena, and the immense fortune could not halt the microscopic bacteria that consumed a brain. It leaves behind a final, lingering question, echoing in the empty rooms and the silent street. What is the true measure of a man's fortress? The strength of the walls he builds to protect his life, or the integrity of the legacy that remains after those walls have turned to dust? If stories like this make you see power from a different angle, subscribe to follow other downfalls as astonishing as this one.